All right. So today I'll be discussing some of the works that came out in ERIPS 2020 regarding mostly self-supervised and semi-supervised learning, and how pre-training with self-supervised methods and self-training and how all these compare with each other, and possible trade-offs of the same. So starting off with self-supervised learning, in the beginning I'll just lay out um, a little bit of an overview as to how this session will go. So I'll first start off talking about self-supervised learning and semi-supervised learning, what they are, and try to introduce some terminologies, and then we'll proceed to the rest of the discussion. So starting off with self-supervised learning, what exactly is self-supervised learning? Basically, a lot of works that have come out in the past have sort of worked on uh, fully supervised learning, which is you have annotations or you have labels in your data that you can learn from. But a lot of the times, it's not possible to have completely annotated data sets, or even if you have completely annotated data sets, it's difficult to have large scale and high quality annotated data sets. This results in problems with first with overfitting, and secondly with robustness of predictions, because sometimes the quality of your data sets may not be as good, and even then um, it's difficult to have complete annotations for tasks like segmentation, in which you need mask level, pixel level annotations. So again, that is an area in which um, you're now looking at self supervision, and basically self supervision is generating or learning representations with supervision that you generate on your own, and you do not have much of an external supervision from annotated labels that you learn from. So yeah, so as you can see, we have a huge amount of raw image and video data available on the internet and otherwise. And this an advantage from this is that it has the ability to cover wider domains and information. So let's say if you just have an ImageNet data set and you train a model on the ImageNet data set, and you sort of just transfer learn it to another task. The information learned from this procedure would only be able to cover the domains that are present in the ImageNet data set and the data set that you're fine tuning on. But let's say that there are classes or there are types of images which are not there in this data set but are sort of similar, or are sort of distinct in their categories. So what using extra data gives us is the ability to cover wider domains and get access or make our models more generalizable. So yeah, so coming to how supervised semi self-supervised learning started off. uh, so initial work on self-supervised learning started off with these pretext or proxy tasks, and basically what they tried to do was to generate supervision from the data without having external annotations. And how they did this was by generating a task on their own, defining a pretext task based on the data, and then learning using that task, learning representations using that task. So just to give you a little bit of an example, let's say if I have let's say if I have a data set, and I rotate all the images randomly by either 0, 90, 180, or 270. I mean 0, 360, 90, 180, or 270. And then my task, my pretext or proxy task would now be to get an image and predict how much that image has been rotated. So this is giving me the opportunity to sort of learn representations without having external annotations, because right now I'm not using any external annotations. I am generating, or I am getting my own annotations from the dataset itself. I'm creating my own task, or that's why it's called a proxy or a pretext task. And once I train my model on this proxy task, I now have learned some visual representations, and I hope to capture these visual representations. And now I can fine tune this model on whatever downstream tasks that I have. So this is basically the idea of self-supervised learning and how proxy or pretext tasks did it. And the problem with these proxy or pretext tasks is that firstly you need to sort of figure out what tasks that you want to use to learn your representations, and that can again vary from the data set that you have. So for example, rotation, as I mentioned, is a common task, but for something, or for some data sets, rotation might not be a good task, and for some cases image restoration or pixel and painting might be a better task. So the question comes, how do you decide what proxy task that you want to use? And again, there are ways you can decide, but again, you want to move away from that manual hardwiring, and you don't want to decide, because there's no way you can be sure before performing the task that whether that task will learn the representations effectively or not. So the question is, how do you move away from this pre-text task or deciding what task that you want to use? The answer is using something called contrastive learning. Basically, what contrastive learning suggests is that given an image and given given two augmented views of the same image. So let's say if I have an image, and if I do random crops of that image, let's say I have two random crops, A1 and A2. Basically, what contrastive learning suggests is that the representations learned for these two augmentations should sort of be similar, and the representations learned from these augmentations of the same image should be dissimilar from another image. So let's say I have just a simple example for cats and dogs. Let's say I have an image of a cat and I have two augmented views of the cat. Let's say just two random crop views. Basically, what contrastive learning, as a rough idea, is that the representations learned from the two augmented views of the cat should sort of be similar, and these two both should be dissimilar to the representation, let's say, which is obtained from a dog. So basically, now you do not have to decide on a pretext task, and you do not have to think about, all right, I need to do this sort of a task to sort of learn representations. Now you're basically relying on the data and hoping that the augmentations, basically that images or classes that have the same so images that have the same class are sort of learned in a similar aspect in the embedding or the representation space. Yeah, so that's a bit of a introduction on what self-supervised learning is. Semi-supervised learning, again, is another technique that we use when we do not have completely annotated data sets. It's basically, again, using some amount of label data and some amount of unannotated data. Yeah, I'll go into that as in when we go through the discussion. So the first work that I want to talk about here is self-training with noisy student improves ImageNet classification. So this is actually a paper that came out in CVPR this year, not NeurIPS, but I just wanted to touch on it to introduce some terminologies. So coming to what is self-training, basically self-training is a bit different from pre-training, and there are advantages and disadvantages of self-training and pre-training, which I will discuss later on. But what self-training does is that basically you train a model. Let's say if you use any way to train a model, either you do it in a fully supervised way or in a self-supervised way. You just train a model, and then the question is, if you have some other data, if you have a large data set, how do you sort of use that data set as extra data to sort of improve your predictions or improve your current model? And what self-training basically does is that, let's say I train my model. Just to give you an example, let's say I train a model on the ImageNet data set, and I get this model, let's say M1. Now I have a huge amount of unannotated data from the internet. Let's say I get a million or a billion images from the internet, and I want to use these extra data for sort of improving my model, because now this extra data contains a lot more information. It covers many more domains, and basically it can help me to get get a more generalizable model with robust predictions. So what I will now do is that I will just generate pseudo labels on this unlabeled data. I will say, okay, whatever my model is, let my model M1 predict values for this unlabeled data set. And once I do get these pseudo labels for this unlabeled data set, I will again train another model, which can be an equal or larger model, and I will add some noise to sort of make this learning task to basically have this incentive for my model to learn something. And I will do this step iteratively. So basically what I'm doing is I predict, initially I just predict on the unlabeled data set, and then once I have these pseudo labels, I am again using it to train an equal or larger model. So that's why it's the term self-training, because it's training an equal or larger model from the data that it has, from the information that it has learned after inferring on some data. I mean, it might sound a bit complex, but yeah, so the sort of noise that I'm talking about here in the model can be either adding some like, data augmentations or dropout or stochastic depth. And the reason why the reason why this sort of a technique works is that when you are learning from these unlabeled data sets on the internet, you are basically aiming to cover wider domains, and that can sort of help in robustness of the predictions, which is also backed up by the results of this paper. And what was pretty astonishing was that these not only that they achieved the state of the art results on ImageNet at the time. I think this middle year when the news about this was announced, and basically what they also achieved was really good results on three variants of ImageNet A, C, and P, which are sort of focused more towards robust predictions. They have corrupted images, they have perturbations and stuff like that. So they're trying to have more generalizable and robust predictions. And basically, this was sort of all like these three variants of ImageNet. Yeah. So coming to this point, why do you think self training works? As I mentioned, that the internet gives us the opportunity, or unlabeled data set. The more data that you have, it gives you an opportunity to cover wider domains and get more robust predictions. So there was a little introduction on some of the terms that we'll be talking about.
Hey, dude, I just have a question.
Yeah.
So, uh, like, if you use the teacher model to generate labels to train this student model, since the teacher model has been trained on a smaller data set, isn't there a large chance of generating wrong labels for the extra data that you have?
Right. Yeah. So that's the thing. That's why you're doing this step sort of iteratively, and if you add this noise to your uh, model, that's what you're trying to hope that it sort of in an iterative fashion it just tries to improve unless it reaches a sort of threshold beyond which it can't do better. So yeah, that's a good point, and that's completely valid. That if you are sort of inferring on the data on a data distribution on which you it's just very different from the data that you've been trained on, then it's very likely that you will sort of go away from getting decent predictions. But if you are using a big enough data set, you hope that there are some similarities and you can sort of capture them iteratively. So let's say if I have ImageNet, if I have a huge model, if I have a huge data set with, let's say, 1 billion images, so you would expect some of the distributions to, or some of the domains to sort of match with the ones given in ImageNet, and you expect them to be learned effectively. And as you do this iteratively with this additional noise, you're hoping that the rest of the domains sort of follow as well. Because if essentially you're learning representations, you're giving your model an opportunity to learn representations from different domains. So yeah, it's a completely valid point. Yeah. So I'll just
Yeah, so
yeah.
like a similar question. Are there any guarantees that this iterative method converges or that every step kind of improves? Because it could also diverge, right? If
Yeah, yeah.
the labels keep getting worse and worse.
I'm not sure about the theoretical robustness of this iterative method and if it's theoretically bound to converge, but their results do suggest that it does. So I'm
And
not sure about
also,
theoretical.
like, do they somehow, like, are they calculating how much more, data they're creating or pseudo labels are creating somehow, like,
Uh,
quantifying it in some way?
are you asking how this sort of varies based on the amount of extra data that you use?
Yeah, so basically, like, how much more, landscape you're covering, like, in each iteration, because um, uh, that'll help, quantify that divergence or convergence as well.
Yeah. So one second, just hold on. Uh,
I had a question. So, during each iteration, the unlabeled data that we're using, so is that from the same data set every time, or are we using data from different domain for each iteration?
so essentially, you just use one big unlabeled data set and you do this iteratively. So, for their experiments, they use the JFT data set. I think it's from Google. I'm not sure. As far as I remember, it's from Google, and it's some 300 million images. Not sure.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'll sort of go more into the recent works that came out in Europe now. So the first one is bootstrap your own latent, and basically a simple one-liner to explain this entire work would be, I mean, it's unfair to explain it in one line, but just to give a little bit of a teaser, it's basically works. It's basically focused to move away from negative samples and contrastive learning. So the thing here is that, as I mentioned, in contrastive learning, your goal or your purpose is to learn representations such that representations for two augmentations of the same image should be similar, and they should be dissimilar from the representations of a different image. And the representations for the different image are sort of referred to as negative samples. The thing here is that negative samples can vary, and how do you choose these negative samples? So there is obviously some sort of relational reasoning between samples, and you're not sure how hard or soft these negative samples can or should be. So let's say if I just have an image of a cat, just go to a simple example of a cat. A lion is a much closer it's much similar to a cat than, let's say, something like some different domain in itself. And the question comes that how do you think about these negative samples now, and how varying these negative samples, or how having a strict it's again getting to a sort of a hardwiring that you need this negative sample to sort of work with this, and you want to move away from that. So basically this work focused on eliminating negative samples while performing contrastive learning. And basically this is how their procedure works. Basically what they do is, let's say I have an input image, I generate augmentations for this, let's say t and t dash. So with two different augmented views, I would have one target network and one online network, which is sort of similar. I mean, a lot of you are familiar with target and policy networks in RL. So yeah, so it's sort of similar to that. And basically what the goal is here, to not have negative samples, and sort of just learn representations for these with the help of these augmented views. The problem with doing that is, let's say I remove negative samples and I just want to make sure that the representations learned from my two positive samples, or my two augmentations of the same sample, are similar. The problem is there is nothing stopping it from learning a constant function, or just learning some identity mapping, right? Because let's say an identity mapping will mean that the representations learned are identical, which is zero similarity, which is completely similar. So that's the problem that we face, and that's why negative samples were considered important. But this work sort of tried to move away from negative samples, and what they did was that they had this two different networks, and the I'll refer to it in simpler terms. Let's say I have a top network and I have a bottom network, and I pass the augmented view T to this network, and it goes through any model, and this is sort of this representation. Let's say if it's some ResNet 50, and let's say it's some ResNet model, and it has this final embedding space of, let's say, E, and this projection is basically some more fully connected layers to sort of change the embedding dimension that you want to have your representation in. So this can again have some stacks of fully connected layers. Yeah. So and sorry. Yeah. So basically, what you are trying to do here is that you want to have this q of theta of z theta, this prediction should be similar to the representation learned from the representation from the below augmentation, from the other augmentation. I mean, the augmentation of the same image. So the thing about this entire thing here is that theoretically, it's again, there's nothing stopping this from learning an identity function, but it by doing this procedure, it somehow doesn't learn this identity procedure, and they've given this explanation in their paper as well. Just open it. 1 second. Yeah, so they mentioned about this here, that as BAYOL does not use an explicit term to prevent collapse, such as negative samples, while minimizing this loss, it may seem that BOYL should converge to the minimum of this loss. Yeah, and they have this very theoretical sort of a proof, which I'm not very sure about, so I didn't go into the depth of it here. But their procedure somehow seems to work and not collapse to that identity function or that problem that I'd spoken about earlier. And a couple of interesting observations or results from this work were that, let's say, basically now you're not dependent on negative samples. So ideally, your results should sort of start improving with smaller batch sizes as well. The problem with SimCLR or the normal contrastive learning approach was that the bigger batch you have, the better chances that you have of having hard negative samples in your contrastive learning. And since you do not need negative samples anymore, this, as you can see, BUIOL starts to do better even with smaller batch sizes. And batch size, again, is a very important problem for training models now because of computational issues. And the second one is impact of progressively removing transformations. So they have these different transformations, and the results sort of show that BUIOL does better than the normal contrastive learning, the SimCLR baseline, with these transformations. And they have a very good explanation for that in their paper as well. Yeah, 1 second. Yeah, so as you can see, contrastive learning methods are sort of sensitive to the choice of augmentations as well. And the reason for that is they showed it with this example. SimCLR does not work when removing color distortions from its image augmentations. Yeah, so, and reason for that is they've given with the help of color histograms. So let's say if I have an image, the color histograms sort of vary across images, but for the same image, they sort of remain similar. And so with these, the contrastive learning approach required these transformations, but without these transformations also, BOL did comparatively better or equally good. So that's why BOL was considered some really strong work when it came out, and it's still considered well. And there's an improvement on BOL also that came out recently. I'm not sure if it's published yet, but there was some work going on there. Yeah. Sorry. I'll just discuss some other. I'll just move in the flow, and then we can come back to doubts. Yeah. So coming to the next work that we'll be discussing today. So big self-supervised models are strong semi-supervised learners, and the results of this paper are sort of a bit non-intuitive, in the sense that you would expect bigger models to sort of overfit and not have such strong generalization capabilities, but the results suggest otherwise clearly. So I'll get into the pipeline, or basically what they did here. Let's say I have a big unlabeled data set, and I train my model using some task agnostic big CNN. I just use a self-supervised learning algorithm to learn representations from this unlabeled data. And Then I fine tune on a small fraction of or label data set that I have. Let's say if I have some sort of label data set, I fine tune on this label data set. And what happens now is that once I fine tune it on my label data set, models generally tend to forget what they had learned in the past, and that's a problem known as catastrophic forgetting. That they once you train it or once you fine tune it on a different data set, it sort of tends to forget what it learned before. So what they now do is that instead of just using this model, they try to learn from the unlabeled data set and the combination, or basically the entire all the data that you have with a self-training fashion by using distillation. So now again, like the thing here is that it's sort of trying to move away from this problem of catastrophic forgetting, and like as I said, the results of this thing are very non-intuitive. So why this is very interesting is because, as you can see in this first image here, I'm not sure if it's visible. I'll just try to zoom in. Yeah, so as you can see in this image here, if you use only 1% of the samples, as you increase the number of parameters, the sort of relative improvement for 1% is still higher as compared to the other cases. And it's sort of not intuitive, because if you're using only a less number of labeled samples, then you would expect that your model would overfit to them. But what the author suggested here, that what might be happening is, since you're using a less number of labeled samples, you are sort of making your model more generalizable or open to learn from the huge unlabeled data that you used. I mean, they've not provided much of a theoretical explanation for that, but they've just provided this intuition that if you're using less number of labeled images, it sort of gives you more opportunity to learn more generalizable features from unlabeled data, which gets to the title: big self-supervised models are strong semi-supervised learners. And another couple of interesting observations from this was that even with 10% of label fractions, what this self-training procedure, with the help of this self-training procedure, it beat the previous state of the art. And not only that, it also beat the supervised baseline for ImageNet. And it's very weird, because you're not even using the entire entire label data set. You're using just 10% of the labels, and you're still able to do better than this fully supervised benchmark. And that sort of brings you to the question that are models sort of confident about what they're predicting, or are they are they biased towards one kind, are they biased towards some kinds of classes? Because basically what their entire intuition is that when you use less number of label fractions, that gives you more opportunity, or that sort of prevents you from learning features that are specific to those labels. So that's very interesting. I mean, all of these observations from this paper were very interesting. And so the first observation, as I mentioned, bigger models are more label efficient. The second observation was that bigger or deeper projection heads improve representation learning. So as I mentioned, these projection heads are sort of how you, again, fully connected layers on top of your any model. And the intuition for this is, I'm not sure if it's very clear as to why this is happening, or why bigger projection heads improve representation learning. Because again, that's it's similar to the first one, that bigger models are having more representation learning capabilities, that you have more number of parameters now, and you're giving yourself the opportunity to learn more generalizable features, while constraining to the fact that you're not forcing your model to learn features which are specific to the labels that you're providing. So they've not provided much of an intuition to this, but it's sort of similar to the first point. And the third one is, again, distillation using unlabeled data improve semi-supervised learning. So this entire procedure of self-training and distillation has, in the previous work, in this work, and in the work that I'll discuss next, it's shown to be doing much better than a normal fine-tuning scenario that we use generally, right? And it's again, it sort of it just brings this question that is how much of a scope for improvement there is in the model itself. Like if you are doing this self-training procedure iteratively, basically uh, you are learning from the predictions you made yourself, and it just seems very paradoxical, but it does work. And I think there's a lot to be explored here still, because uh, to me, I'm not entirely convinced as to why it works, but it does work. And the only explanation that I have about it is that it gives more generalizable features. And yeah, so this is one of the more exciting, or one of the works that I want to talk about in detail. So this is rethinking pre-training and self-training. And as you all know, pre-training, what pre-training is, and I'd mentioned it in the past, you train a model on a data set and then you fine tune it on another data set. And you self-training, as I've mentioned throughout this discussion. Uh, the thing here is that you would expect pre-trained networks to do better, right? So that's why you generally use pre-trained models for a lot of your tasks, and then you fine-tune it on your other downstream tasks or any other data set that you have. But the results are very interesting in the fact that they show that when you use large number of augmentations, so under stronger data augmentations and more labeled data, the value of pre-training diminishes. So as you can see in this first figure here, if you use more augmentations, the value of pre-training diminishes. So as you can see, this pink line, the random initialization, it does better than pre-trained weights under the case that you use this augment 4. Augment 4 is a high level of augmentation. They've mentioned what augment 1, 2, 3, 4 are. I'll show you. Yeah. Yeah, so augment 1, augment 2, augment yeah. So augment S1 is sort of the weakest augmentation, just flips and crops. Augment S2 is the second strongment augmentation, which is auto augment, which is auto augment is basically sort of deciding the augmentation strategy based on the data that you have, data and network that you have. So third one is the strongest, third strongest augmentation, which is large scale color jittering, auto augmentation, flips and crops, and augment S4 is the stronger augmentation, which has this rand augment, flip crops, and large scale jittering. So basically what they said was that under these, if you have stronger augmentations, then the value that you get from pre-training diminishes, which is little non-intuitive, because that's what we all generally use, right? We use pre-trained models a lot for a lot of our tasks. And again, the reason for this is very similar to the sort of discussion that we've been having earlier, that when you use pre-trained models, your representations learned are sort of biased to the network, the data that you're learning from, and that sort of constrains your ability to learn more generalizable features or more robust features. And this other comparison again, so they use a fraction of the COCO dataset, so they vary the fraction of the COCO dataset that they're using. And as you can see, this random, when they use the complete COCO dataset, this random initialization does better than pre-trained initialization. And under low amounts of labeled data, this ImageNet trained models are doing better as compared to random initialization. Yeah, and they sort of study the causes and effects of this, in the sense that self-training helps in high and strong data augmentation regimes. So what, after they did these experiments with pre-training, they were now curious as to what a better way to learn these models from the huge amount of data that we have. So after exploring pre-training, they did the same experiments on self-training procedures. and they found out that self-training not only helped improve performance, but it was also much more robust than pre-training based methods. So as you can see in the next couple of tables here, so they study with all of these different 4 augmentation strategies, and they have reported the random initialization scores for detection on the COCO dataset. As you can see from ImageNet initialization, which is the pre-training procedure, auto-augment S1, with auto-augment S1, it does better. With auto-augment S2 and the others, the detection performance drops. As I mentioned earlier, that with stronger augmentations, pre-training did not seem to be beneficial. So they did this again, the same thing with random initialization with self-training, and what they found out that this sort of improved performance further as compared to a random initialization setting. And they did this for not only detection but also classification on they also did some classifying experiments. And yeah, so they also did some other experiments. So self-training works across dataset sizes and is additive to pre-training. So they sort of found out that yeah, the gains that are obtained from self-training are not just exclusive, but they, if let's I'll just explain with this table. So I'll first I've done this random initialization, and I used 20, 50, and 100% of the data set for training on COCO detection, and use this auto augment S4 strategy. And when I use this random initialization with ImageNet self training, I show some improvements on each of these. Now, if I do this ImageNet training, ImageNet initialization or ImageNet pre-training, and I do uh, on top of this, now if I, after doing the pre-training, if I now do self-training, then again it shows that even after doing pre-training, if I now do self-training later on, it's still additive, that it's still providing gains. So basically what their conclusion from this was that self-training is not just a wired solution. It's not something that's set, or it's just working for one training regime. It's basically generalizable features, no matter what your initialization, if it's random initialization or if it's ImageNet or any other pre-trained initialization, it's giving you an opportunity to refine your predictions and learn more generalizable features. So that's what their inference from this was. And another one here is that self-supervised pre-training also hurts when self-training helps in high data and strong high slash augmentation, high data and strong augmentation regimes. So as you can see, for random initialization, you get this 41.1 average precision on the COCO object detection. For ImageNet initialization in a supervised fashion, you sort of, the performance declines. For ImageNet training, again done in a self-supervised fashion using SimSailR contrastive learning, again it's not beneficial as they've mentioned earlier. But if you do it with self-training, it does better. So even under the cases where pre-training does not improve performance, self-training does, and that's what they inferred from this. And the intuition for the weak performance of pre-training is that pre-training is not aware of the task of interest and can fail to adapt. And such adaptation is often needed while switching tasks, because, for example, good features for ImageNet may discard positional information which is needed for COCO. So what this means is basically ImageNet is sort of a classification data set, and a lot of the features or COCO or detection in general is a more position-aware task, in which the position of the objects in your data set also matter a lot, and you need to learn positional information as well. And so the type of information that you're learning in your pre-training task might be different from what your goal or objective is finally, and that might be a possible reason why pre-training does not sort of do well across tasks. So the conclusions from this are that self-training works well in every setup that we tried: low regime data, high regime data, weak augmentations, and even strong augmentations. Self-training also is effective with different architectures, so it's not just like a hardwired solution that's working on one particular SN model. It's very scalable across different architectures, across different data sets, and across different tasks. So they did these bunch of experiments to show that self-training is actually effective, and it's not just something that's working for one or two cases. And secondly, in terms of generalizability, self-training works well even when pre-training fails, but also when pre-training succeeds. So it's basically invariant of how pre-training performs. It self-training does well no matter what pre-training is able to do. So in terms of scalability, self-training does provide proof to be perform well as compared to more labeled data and better models. And another question that comes up now is that why don't we always do self-training? It's a very intuitive question to come here, but as you know, this self-training is an iterative procedure, and you require a large amount of data set, large unlabeled, even though unlabeled, it's a huge data set. It's, let's say if you're using 300 million images and you're doing this self-training iteratively, it's obviously not computationally feasible to perform this uh, for for applications. And that's why I think self-training, that's the potential drawback of self-training, that it needs to do this training on a huge amount of data iteratively to sort of do well. And in cases where you do not have access to such computational resources, or do not have uh, huge amounts of data, then it's pre-training is still the option that we have. And coming to the next work that I want to discuss here, it's self-supervised learning through the eyes of a child. This is sort of different. I mean, it's slightly different to the works that I've discussed above, which were more about uh, self-training and pre-training and how they differ, and what works and how they work and stuff like that. But this is slightly different. This is coming from a slightly neuroscience perspective. And basically, the intuition of this paper was that they did these experiments, and there's a phenomena in neuroscience, which the name of which I don't recall correctly. Basically, what the phenomena is, that if you show a little child something at a very very young age, let's say at the age of 3 months, the child will not be able to sort of make much sense out of it. But if you do the same thing after a few months, let's say after 9 months, then the child is able to understand it much better. So one common experiment for that is that you hide a remote under the blanket. So there's a video on YouTube. Yeah, I can like share a link to that, and they've sort of explained this phenomena very well in that. But I don't remember what the phenomena is called. So basically, there's a child who there's a parent and there's a child, and the parent hides the remote under the blanket, and the parent asks the child to sort of find where the remote is, or just pick the remote up from pick the remote from the under the blanket or under the cover or whatever. So what the experiment shows, that at the age of 3 months, the child is not able to find where the remote is, even though it's just under the cushion or just under the blanket. The child is not able to make much sense of where the parent had kept it. But at later stages, let's say at 6 months or 9 months, the child is able to do the same task and without any confusion. So that's what that tells us, is that one, it might be because that the student has the child has now learned over time, over a large from 3 months to 9 months, and he has seen the surroundings around, like the child has seen its surroundings so much that it now it has more information basically of the surroundings around him. That might be one reason. The other reason is that it may learn temporally, and slowly over time it sort of starts to learn things around it slowly. And it's the explanation or the intuition of what they are doing now is basically using temporal information in self-supervised learning schemes. So what their intuition is, that if I just not give any context about where the remote is to the child, if I just put the remote under the blanket without showing the child that the remote was put under the blanket, he will never know that the remote is under the blanket. And the only way for him to understand that the remote is under the blanket is if he is shown some context temporally that it's been put, or if the parent's hand is under the blanket or something like that. So you need some sort of temporal knowledge, and that's how children learn. It's not so, a lot of visual learning in computer vision is not from static images, it's from temporal evolution or videos basically. So basically what this work was sort of focused at is learning, self-supervised learning, at the same time learning from temporal information in videos. So they came with this SkyCam dataset, which is a video dataset which was collected by mounting cameras on children as they were growing. I mean, it's pretty tedious for a child to do that, but they collected this dataset, and I feel sad for the children who are part of this experiment. But yeah, so they collected this SkyCam dataset, and they sort of experimented with some self-supervised learning techniques. So the first one here is temporal classification, and basically what this means is that you split your video up into multiple segments temporally. Let's say if I have a clip of, let's say I have a video of 128 frames, and I can split this 128 frame video into some n number of segments, each containing some m frames. So now my task is, given a frame, I need to predict which segment it belongs to, and that's how I'm sort of. And since I have multiple segments to select from over time, I'm sort of learning. I'm hoping to learn temporal features from this technique. The second one is static contrastive learning, momentum contrast, which is basically learning from static images, and they sort of use it to compare what works well and how it works well. And the third one is temporal contrastive learning, and this is the same as contrastive learning, but in this case, their contrastive learning or similarity metric is, instead of augmentations, the adjacent frames or the frames that are next to each other. Let's say in my video, I have a frame t, and the frame t minus 1 and t plus 1 will now be adjacent frames, and they will be positive frames for this contrastive learning framework, and the frames that are distant from this current frame will be negative samples for the contrastive learning methodology here. And yeah, so what they found out was that the models that they trained learned from contextual cues as well, since the activation maps are larger. So once they trained these models, they, after getting predictions, they sort of analyzed the activation maps, and they found out that the maps were not only focused on just exactly the object in focus, or the object that you are focusing at. So let's say if you have a simple cat, and if you're just running inference on a cat, the activation map was not just focused on the cat, but also on some of the area around it, which means that contextual information is being learned. Like, learning from contextual cues is important. And yeah, so yeah, coming to some other results from this work, basically. Just give me a second. All right, so I'll just yeah. Okay, so coming to this next set of results that this paper presented. So basically what they suggest is that downstream, so they perform this downstream linear classification task. The TCS is the model which is trained on the videos from the S. So basically they trained on videos from 3 different children, which is S, A, and Y, and they use this S1 for inference, if I'm not wrong. I think they used the S1 for inference, and what they found out was that So basically this MoCo Temp-S is momentum contrast temporally learning from the S dataset, or the videos from the S child. Uh, MoCo ImageS is again static model which is trained from the images from the S child. ImageNet is the normal ImageNet trained model. RandomNet is just a random untrained random model initialized, and HOG is the histogram of oriented gradients model, which is a sort of a classical model in computer vision. So basically what their results suggested was that, as you can see from this first diagram here, the model which was trained on TCS, which is temporal classification on the S dataset, does better here. And this is again intuitive, sort of, because you are doing your inference on the S dataset, and since you're learning in a self-supervised way from the S dataset, it's sort of intuitive that it would do better. But even for this A and Y dataset, it does almost similar. And like some interesting observations are that even if you 1 second. Yeah, so one. So this first A figure was on the inference on the labeled S dataset, and this other figure here was inference on this toy box dataset, and this so 1 second. Actually, I forgot what I was going to say here. I didn't write the notes for this thing. 1 second. Fine. I'll just get to this in a minute. So what the limitations of this work was that the dataset limitation was the dataset that they used was sort of limited to 1 week of equivalent learning, because although they collected data over multiple years, but the frequency of data collection was very less. Let's say a couple of hours a week, and that sort of restrains your learning capabilities to only 1 week of overall learning. The second thing is that we humans learn from multi-model cues a lot of the time, and even if you are not able to understand things just visually, we use a lot of multiple or multi-model cues, let's say audio or some other sensory information, to learn. And this sort of multiple modalities are not much explored in self-supervised learning yet, and possible problems from that for that may be that when you use multiple modalities, you're basically increasing the complexity of your learning task, and it's also sort of difficult to manage learning from multiple modalities, because learning from videos and learning from audio are sort of different and difficult at the same time, and doing them both or optimizing them both simultaneously is a problem that a lot of it's a current problem that researchers are working on as well. And self-supervised algorithms use unrealistic augmentations to learn, and an attempt to more intuitive self-supervised learning can be moving away from such handcrafted or thought out augmentations. So like coming from even works that have come out now, we use some augmentations, as we had mentioned above, regarding strong and weak augmentations in some of the earlier works. Strong augmentations did reduce performance in some cases, and it sort of gets to the question that what augmentations need to be used for self-supervised learning algorithms, and is there a way to completely eliminate having that sort of a scenario? But yeah, these are sort of the questions that are still there with respect to self-supervised learning. I know there's just 4 minutes left, and I think I'll just leave 4 minutes for discussion.